One of my personal favorite genres is horror anthologies. 4 or 5 short films connected by segue scenes that glue all the parts together. In the case of Tales from the Crypt, we even get a host or guide with the crypt keeper. Sometimes they talk directly to the audience, and sometimes they're just another character only interacting with the reality of the scenes. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of these movies. Probably way more than that, honestly. I really don't know. Horror anthologies are a subgenre of horror, and we only do microgenres here, so we're going to have to whittle this down a little bit. In the Microgenre episode on severed hand movies, I discussed the story in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors with a Severed Hand, and in the episode on killer plants, I covered the story with the deadly vines. It would have probably been in one of those videos that I mentioned that it was made by Amicus films, and that Amicus films were often mistaken for Hammer horror films, and it's easy to see why. They were made during the same era, in similar genres, using the same actors in a lot of the cases. Amicus was created by 2 American producers, Milton Subotsky and Max Rosenberg, but why call it Amicus?
It comes from the Latin word meaning friends. What should we call the company? Enemies?
Fair enough. Well, Dr. Terror's House of Horror might have been their first horror movie, but it wasn't Amicus's only horror anthology movie. In this episode of Microgenres, we are going to look briefly at all 7 Amicus Films horror anthologies, as well as a few bonus extra movies that are often mistaken or referenced when discussing the Amicus films. Now you might ask, why? What makes horror anthologies so great, and why do I love them so much? Well, beyond getting more stuff packed into one movie, I think the real craft that I enjoy is the short story format. I mean, sure, anthologies have the added connecting scenes to tie all the stories together, and that is somewhat unique to the genre, and it can make the 5 short films greater as a whole piece, but really the sweet craft here is in the brevity of the storytelling. When you pitch your work, or if you were to pitch your work as a writer to a comic publisher, let's say, we intrinsically want to pitch the biggest and most epic concept for a series and the grand arc of the characters and crossovers and merchandising possibilities and blah 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 blah. But what editors really prefer is if you can tell a whole story in 2 or 3 pages and make it compelling and interesting, because it's a lot harder to establish your characters, motivations, twists, and surprises in a very contained amount of space and keep a reader's interest. This is the same challenge facing storytellers of an anthology project. Now, as a group of films, they are incredibly similar. They're all within a year or 2 of each other, made by the same studio, sharing many actors between them, so for the sake of being less monotonous, I won't go into detail for each story in the anthologies. 7 movies is enough to cover without getting bogged down with all these many short stories, let alone trying to cover a synopsis of each of the 4 or 5 mini-stories in each film. That would be like 35 stories, and I'm only one man, right? I mean, if I watch 35 movies, do my eyes not bleed? Okay, I'll do the synopsis. I was just kidding. I can do them really quickly, and I'm kind of OCD enough that I'm unable to skip them anyway. So I'm going to point out the framing story that glues the rest of the vignettes together. I'll give a brief rough rundown of what the plots are of the stories, and then a few other highlights, if any, before moving on to the next one. You ready? Here we go. Dr. Terror's House of Horror in 1965. Director Freddie Francis starts our list off with Peter Cushing, Christopher Lee, Bernard Lee, and Donald Sutherland starring as passengers on a train who get a tarot card reading from Dr. Terror himself, and with each reading, we get to see their grisly demise. Now, as mentioned at the start of the video, there's a creepy killer plant story as well as a severed hand story, but then we also get a werewolf story, a vampire story, and a voodoo story where a white guy tries to steal a tribal song and he gets cursed for it. This is the progenitor of all the movies to follow, the template, setup, and a formula that works really, really well. The documentary on the DVD dives into all of the Amicus founder and producer Subotsky's influences, basically making the case that the stories were all lifted and shortened for this project.
When Subotsky said, Dr. Terror's House of Horrors is where it all began, the script was an original, I wrote it all myself, I don't think he was being strictly honest there. I think you can look at pretty much every story in this film and spot the recent release, by recent I mean recent to 1948, that inspired, he absolutely adored Dead of Night to the degree that Cushing's opening line in Dr. Terror's House of Horrors
I think there is room for one more in here, is there not?
is effectively a quote from the Phantom Bus Conductor, played by Miles Nelson in Dead of Night, who famously said,
Just room for one more inside, sir.
the werewolf story gives us a female werewolf. Well, Columbia made a not very good film in 1944 called Cry of the Werewolf. The Creeping Vine story, Universal had made a little B-movie in 1945 called The Spider-Woman Strikes Back, in which Gail Sondergaard played a sort of female mad scientist called Zenobia Dollard, who was experimenting with sentient plants. The voodoo story, as well as quoting from the Cornell Woolrich story, reminds me of a 1944 film called Zombies on Broadway. The disembodied hand story fuses together two films of the mid-40s. Of course, it references The Beast with Five Fingers, but also a Universal programmer called House of Horrors, which was about a psychotic sculptor played by Martin Kozlik, who is bedeviled by very, very snooty critics. The vampire story, frankly, plays very like Cat People. As well as having a Luton walk quoted directly from Cat People, it has an American young man who has married a foreign woman. In the vampire story, she's French. Of course, in Cat People, she was Serbian. There's also a very dodgy doctor. There's a very dodgy psychiatrist in Cat People. So, now, there's nothing wrong with that. Frankly, there's nothing original under the sun, is there? But when you do consider that it was written in 1948, and you think about the horror movies that Subotsky is very likely to have seen in the 2 or 3 years preceding that, then I think you can see the bare bones of Dr. Terror's House of Horrors laid out exactly.
This was a skill that Subotsky learned by buying other films and chopping them up in editing, because he learned that it's like really much easier to recut a movie for a foreign market than it is to make one from scratch. This movie is a highlight on the list because of how perfectly it captured the anthology formula so early on, and it's still honestly one of my favorites on this list, even with some of the worst, corniest vampire effects ever put to screen. Torture Garden, 1967. The connective tissue between each vignette in Torture Garden takes place at a carnival, where Dr. Diablo spins tales of the fates of fools who wander into his sideshow tent. Specifically, the mechanism here is a wax maquette of a woman with shears of fate who will spin off your future and then sever it when you die.
This is a figure from ancient legend. Atropos, goddess of destiny. In the left hand, skein of life. In the right, the shears of fate. Each colored thread represents a human life, and the shears have the power to cut it short.
The cast features Jack Palance and Peter Cushing. Burgess Meredith plays our carnival host, Dr. Diabolo. Meredith is best known now, I think, for playing the Penguin on the Adam West Batman show. It was written by Robert Bloch, who wrote Psycho, and it was also directed by Freddie Francis, who directed Dr. Terror's House of Horror. He's going to pop up again on the list. There are 4 stories featured that include a guy looking to get his inheritance from an ailing relative only to be taking orders from his demon cat. There's a young woman caught up in the fast-paced life of celebrity in a sort of twist on the Fountain of Youth story. There's a homicidal piano jealous of its owner's new girlfriend, and the last pits Peter Cushing against Jack Palance as collectors of Edgar Allan Poe memorabilia who are obsessed to the point of violence. Both this story and the bumper to the movie with Dr. Diabolo are pretty odd. I don't want to ruin it here, but this is a tight 100 minutes, excellent delivery. The House That Dripped Blood in 1970. So another stacked cast of old English horror class acts like Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, Denham Elliott, John Pertwee, and Ingrid Pitt, with all stories based on the work of Robert Bloch, who had just written Torture Garden. The entire framework is a policeman investigating a murder at a house and finding out that the house has a history of violence in it. We get Denham Elliott as a writer who writes about a psychopathic murderer, the manifestations of which haunt him and his wife. Peter Cushing is in a waxworks museum story. Christopher Lee moves to the house with his daughter that he tries to keep sequestered away from other children and toys. And the final story has John Pertwee doing his best Christopher Lee impression as a Dracula actor being taken over by the role. It's pretty great to get Dracula and Grand Moff Tarkin and the Third Doctor, one each in these stories. Ingrid Pitt is actually another icon in cult movies, playing the sexy vampiress infamously in The Vampire Lovers and Countess Dracula.
Who?
These stories are all solid, and we are in full swing now. The formula's working, and they know what they have here. And now we're getting, like, the best material. Tales from the Crypt, 1972. Yes, the Tales from the Crypt, based on the EC Comics title and adapted later in the 90s by HBO into a killer TV series. The older version features Joan Collins, Peter Cushing, and Patrick McNee. Director Freddie Francis returns a third time. The cast literally meet in a crypt to hear their fates told to them by the Crypt Keeper, but not the one that we probably mostly all have in our brains at this point. The one in the movie is this old guy. He's an old English guy in a hood, like you'd see on the old comic covers.
Why did you come in here?
At the start, in the opening credits, it says that all the stories are based on the actual EC comics. The first story is one of a wife killing her husband at Christmas, and while disposing of the body, has to contend with this psycho Santa Claus. This is my favorite story, and it was actually remade in the first season of the HBO show, and it's my favorite episode of that series. I actually think the TV series is far superior, but that's just me. Then there's a couple that gets into a car crash, but after getting out of the wreck, something's amiss, giving away like the twist that would ruin the reveal in that story, so I won't do that. The third is about terrible neighbors, as an uppity rich prick is picking on a poor old man by having the city take away his dogs and making parents think that he's a molester, and then we see their fates by the end. The fourth is a version of the monkey's paw wish fulfillment with a dark twist on it.
The monkey's paw, that's what it was.
Yeah, that's what I said.
Do you know the story of the monkey's paw?
Yeah, I just said that. I said it was a monkey's paw story. Weirdo. And the final story here is about blind veterans whose care home has been taken over by a soulless bean counter who takes advantage of them, pushing them to the brink of death with no heat, poor food, etc. And this particular story was remade somewhat into another horror anthology, Snoop Dogg's Hood of Horror, where Ernie Hudson's the leader of the retired vets whose slumlord landlord abuses them. I think this is the better version, but no surprise there, though. One of the tastiest parts of these stories are the twists and unexpected turns, and I can't really give away too much without ruining the fun for you, but I think each of these is worth a watch. The twists still work really effectively. Asylum, 1972. This is the third of these films to be written by Robert Bloch, and it's directed by Roy Ward Baker. The setup for the stories is that a doctor is coming to an insane asylum to evaluate inmates, and we get to hear their stories and then decide which one of them is the director of the asylum. The first is a voodoo story.
It is not voodoo.
Isn't it? I mean, it's about a man who kills his wife only to find her severed limbs less than cooperative. The second story is about a tailor who's commissioned to make a very peculiar suit for Peter Cushing. Each of these main three stories has a big name actor of the day. Britt Ekland starred in the third story and Herbert Lom in the last one. Britt stars as Lucy, the troublemaking friend for a disturbed girl who has been released from an asylum into a care home with a nurse, but Lucy keeps getting her into mischief.
She's not your nurse, you know. She's your guard, your keeper. But George wouldn't do a thing like that. Oh, wouldn't he?
And the Herbert Lom story focuses on his character, who's a doctor who believes that you can put like his spirit into small dolls that he outfits with all normal human organs, albeit tiny little organs. It's definitely one of the weirder tales in the movie for sure. It's probably one of the weirder stories throughout all of these movies.
Call it my final creation.
That's your face.
Mm-hmm. My face and inside my body, correct to the smallest detail.
The Vault of Horror in 1973. Another EC Comics adaptation, a pseudo-sequel to Tales from the Crypt, Vault of Horror brings along Denham Elliott and even fan favorite Doctor Who, Tom Baker.
Dream, vision, phobia, obsession, fear.
5 strangers get on an elevator and begin to descend into the basement. Getting off the elevator, they seem to be trapped and begin telling each other stories of their nightmares. We get a vampire story, a story about an uptight and emotionally abusive husband whose rules begin to drive his wife crazy. The third story is similar to the voodoo story in Dr. Terror's House of Horror, where a tourist in India kills a street performer for their magic rope, only to get a bit of karma for their troubles. And then the last story is an actual voodoo story because, well, that well will never run dry. Tom Baker plays an artist who uses voodoo to get revenge on his enemies through his paintings. I think the Tales from the Crypt was a little bit better than Vault of Terror, but they're both good. From Beyond the Grave 1974. Now, the framing device in the last of Amicus's anthologies is Peter Cushing as an antiques shop owner selling cursed items to jerks. So 4 jerks come through throughout the movie, and the items they buy inform their tragic end. So the first story is about a mirror that evokes an almost Cenobite-like spirit that needs blood. The second is a medal of service, like a medal of honor, and a man who wishes he didn't live such a mundane life with this borderline abusive wife. And the third story is about a man with a demon on his shoulder that starts trying to kill his wife, and he needs it excised. The last story is about an antique door that, once installed, opens to a room that isn't supposed to be there. This might be my least favorite of these movies. The formula is a little worn at this point, and the stories are told straight but seem to have no flair. It's all played very matter-of-factly. Although I did like the antique mirror story quite a bit because of how dreamlike the sequence is. The 2 main producers and founders of Amicus, 2 Americans living in London, they part ways in the next few years, and Amicus is no more. Shortly after that, Hammer follows suit, outlived by their library of killer works. So this was their last portmanteau horror film, but that doesn't mean that we are at the end of our list. There are a few extra features that are often confused for Amicus productions, even though they aren't, so let's just cover a few here. These films all look the part of an Amicus movie because they came out around the same time and were produced by or starred people associated with the Amicus films, people like Peter Cushing. So Tales That Went from 1973 is actually a World Film Services movie. It stars Joan Collins and Donald Pleasance, who both appear in other movies on this list, and it was directed by Freddie Francis again. This movie has a similar setup to Amicus's Asylum from 1972, where a new doctor is being introduced to inmates at an asylum, and each tells their story.
Let's take a look at these rather special visitors of yours.
There's a boy with a not-so-imaginary pet tiger. And then the strangest story, in my opinion, of any of these movies. It's called The Penny Farthing. An antique shop owner gets a weird portrait with the ghost of Uncle Albert in it.
Ta-da! Presenting Uncle Albert.
One of these days, I'll brain you. Who's Uncle Albert, anyway?
Oh, I don't know, one of Aunt Kate's various relatives.
As well as one of those old-timey bicycles with the giant wheel, like the logo of the prisoner. They're actually called penny farthings. Anyway, the ghost seems to make him or compel him to ride the bicycle, which travels back in time almost 100 years, where he acts out Uncle Albert's courtship to his love, and then Albert starts escaping from the portrait and reconstituting himself. It's a deliciously bizarre, it's kind of random, but yeah, I dig it. My favorite story is one where this guy brings home this chunk of a tree as modern art, and he places it in the middle of his home, but he becomes obsessed with it, and it becomes more humanesque and weirdly sexual. And in the last story, we get a Hawaiian twist on the old voodoo tropes with some flesh eating. These movies are still pretty solid, but perhaps not innovative enough to avoid audience fatigue at this point.
Up until now, apart from the patients, I'm the only person to have seen the truth. I was prepared for it. Of course, I wanted to see it. I don't know how such a revelation would affect the mind of another human being.
In 1977, we get The Uncanny, which is an English-Canadian production filming in Quebec. It's another Peter Cushing movie, and Donald Pleasance is also in it. This one's all about cats. All the stories are about cats. It plays out like Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. The framing device for the stories is that Peter Cushing is trying to convince his publisher that his new book on the evil power of cats is real and it's worth publishing. So he tells 3 stories from his research to illustrate this. The first story is about an old rich cat lady and her conniving nephew and her maid that conspire against her, leaving her fortune to her cats. The second is about a little orphan girl who stays with her aunt and her bully of a cousin who torments her until the little girl and the cat team up to get revenge. And the third story is about Donald Pleasance, who plays a man who stages an accident that kills his wife on the set of a film only to replace her with a younger actress and lover, despite how his wife's cat might actually feel about that. I like the idea of Peter Cushing versus cats, but I think that this is maybe a low moment in these movies. They're all very similar in format and execution and look, but within that range, I think this is at the lower, flatter end of the scale. There just isn't much exciting here. There's no real shocking twists. The ones that do come are sometimes hampered by the ridiculous nature or being coupled with less than stellar special effects. And I could see some cat people getting right into it, and I guess I would give it extra points for being a Canadian co-production, filming in Canada, and setting a story in Canada as well. The cat angle wasn't my personal favorite, but each of these movies knows how to operate. They know the layout and the terrain. The formula's just getting a little well-worn now. And the Monster Club. Not the Monster Squad, the Monster Club, 1981. The last pick for my runners-up is the most awkward of them all. The entire setup is from the monster's perspective. So Vincent Price is a vampire who drinks the blood of a famous horror novelist and then invites him to the Monster Club, where he explains the lineage of the different kinds of monsters.
You see, first we have the primate monsters, vampires, werewolves, and ghouls. Now, a vampire and a werewolf would produce a werevamp. But a werewolf and a ghoul would produce a wereghoul. But a vampire and a ghoul would produce a vamghoul.
And it gets ridiculous.
A wereghoul and a werevamp would produce a shaddy. Now, a wereghoul and a vamghoul would produce a maddie. But a werevamp and a vamghoul would produce a ratty. Now, if a shaddy were to mate with a ratty or a maddie, the results would be a muck. A muck.
And so each story is something of a showcase for each of the different kinds of monster. The first is a shadmock, who is ugly but rich and preyed upon by two scam artists. The second story features Donald Pleasance hunting a vampire who's been hiding in the city as a domestic family man. And the third is about a filmmaker who goes on a location hunt only to be trapped by a village of ghouls who won't let him leave. There are only 3 stories in this one, likely somewhat due to the musical numbers in between. Yeah, there are some pop tunes. The most mismatched part of the movie is the band that plays in the club between the vignettes, in my opinion.
She's the kind of girl to drive a man insane. Think I love her so, and I give her pain.
The genre conventions are a bit long in the tooth coming out in 1981, and I think that's the reason that this one feels a little sillier. Story is best taken as half comedy, in my opinion. 1981 is 3 years after Halloween came out. We started in 1965 when this format was fresh and fun, but by 1981, the Hammer style of horror movie has become passé. You can see how these movies all fit together. The same studio, the same genre, the same creators, too. Like Royd Warbaker directed 3 films. Freddie Francis directs 4. Milton Subotsky, who was the founder, produced 8 out of the 10. Peter Cushing stars in 7 of them. Donald Pleasance in 4. Robert Bloch wrote 3. Right? Anyway, so have fun. If you haven't seen all 10 of these movies, you might try tracking down a few, and I will see you guys next week.